Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Cure. I'm Seema Kumar. I'm the CEO of Cure, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the world of the DOJ, or Department of Justice, and talk about false claims, cybersecurity, illegal kickbacks, and all in the healthcare industry. And it's a serious topic, and so we're going to spend some time learning more about it because, today with us is an expert. We have Matthew Feely, who is a Deputy Chief Healthcare Fraud Coordinator, Civil Division in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of Florida. Throughout his career, Matt has led investigations and prosecutions of Healthcare False Claims Act enforcement actions that have led to hundreds of millions in settlements. He's recovered significant amounts of money for the U.S. government, and this includes a $475.6 million from an opioid manufacturer, $1.25 million from a doctor billing for medical services that he did not or she did not perform, and $3.8 million from an electronics healthcare record software manufacturer for violations of the anti-kickback statutes, and $830K from the compounding pharmacies that defrauded federal healthcare programs. Oh my God, what a world we live in. He also has prosecuted cases related to fraudulent COVID-19 cures and violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So Matt, welcome. This is serious business that we're talking about, and we're going to dive right in and understand all about this, whole area. But before we do that, I just wanted to first of all extend a personal welcome to Cure. Welcome, and I hope you enjoyed our campus and being here in the middle of New York City.
Seema, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here today and talk to the audience at Cure. And I know you are all doing great, very important things, bringing healthcare community together. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here, and it's an opportunity for me to speak about what we're doing at the Department of Justice. So thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you for being here, because we are all looking to get educated in this arena because, as healthcare leaders and, those of you joining us on LinkedIn and Twitter and YouTube, I want to also, encourage you to listen because, this is something that we all need to know more about. So sometimes you don't even know that you're sort of treading into these sort of territories. So before we get into all of this, and also about what your office does, tell us about your career journey. How do you become and how do you decide to become a health fraud coordinator in the United States Department of Justice? How does one choose a career like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't set out to work in healthcare or enforcement related to healthcare. I clerked for a federal judge after law school here in New York City for a couple of years, and then I went to work for some major law firms, both in Chicago and in Miami. About 16 years in major law firms. And then I had an opportunity to come over to the Department of Justice. It was an opportunity to serve the country and the community. So I took it. I've been with the department now for about 6 years. And the last 2 years I've served as the Deputy Chief of the U.S. Attorney's Office, or the Civil Division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Florida.
That's great. So the Southern District of Florida, right? And the judicial mandate of your office is what, and how does it translate across the country?
Sure. So just some basics about how the Department of Justice is structured and the U.S. Attorney's offices. There's 94 U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the United States. There's 3 in Florida. There's the northern, the middle, and the southern. So each one of those districts has one U.S. attorney that's appointed by the president. And then they have a bunch of assistant United States attorneys that work for him or her. So our office has about 250 AUSAs, we call them, and we're one of the largest districts in the United States. So we enforce the federal laws in the district. That's our mandate, but we also, very importantly, work with the Department of Justice as a whole across the entire United States. We work with different districts, and we also serve as basically the law firm for federal agencies. So we get referrals from HHS, from CMS. We work with their law enforcement agents. We also work with FBI agents. We sometimes work with the Department of Justice if they have healthcare issues that arise related to their federal healthcare programs. So, it's really a lattice, I would say, of different structures and organizations, all of them federal, and then we work in conjunction. We also work sometimes in conjunction with states' attorney generals if we have cases where they have an open investigation that overlaps with ours.
So, you know, the DOJ is considered like the law firm for every U.S. federal agency. We hear feedback over there. And what advice do you have for entrepreneurs and small and mid-sized healthcare companies who have to navigate all of the above?
So one of the things I think, Seema, is important to talk about in reference to that question is federal funding related to grants. And I know that a lot of people in your audience, entrepreneurs and investors, might be applying for federal funding related to their studies or research or what have you. Anytime you're seeking federal dollars, you have a risk that you may be violating the False Claims Act. And I can talk a little bit more detail about the False Claims Act, but...
Wait, you mean like I could be applying for an ARPA-H grant?
Yes.
And be violating something?
If there's something wrong with your
application?
With your application itself.
Okay.
And
wow.
there's been some fairly prominent cases in the last couple of years, particularly relating to universities that didn't make the proper disclosures about their researchers' affiliations with foreign institutions. Those got a lot of press because there's a political component to it. But one of the important things for investors and entrepreneurs to understand is that any time you're receiving federal money and you're making some type of representation or attestation on a form, you may be subjecting yourself to false claims risk if there's something that's an error in the form that you've submitted.
And you know, as an entrepreneur, you're often working against the clock and you're fast-paced.
Sure.
And you try to do things quickly. So the chances for making just a simple error is quite high.
Sure, and you make a really good point. And you know, we're not trying to bring enforcement actions based on just simple errors. If there's an element of intent, and it's often not intent to defraud, but intent to just not do what they should be doing as far as their due diligence about the researchers that they're working with, or if there's a pattern of negligence and you know, just willfulness in not meeting the requirements of the rules. But simple mistakes, we're not in the business of bringing enforcement actions based on just simple mistakes.
So, you know, and then you compound that with AI. Right? AI in healthcare is, you know, it's all the rage. It was all the rage last year. It's still all the rage. I mean, how do you believe the technology has changed the landscape, and what should people be, you know, cognizant about, whether it is working on AI or using AI in terms of like whether it's applications, whether it's EHRs, which is cybersecurity, fraud, all of the above?
Sure. So I think from the government's perspective, you know, you all are at the forefront of technology and harnessing technology for the greater good to make healthcare, the provision of healthcare more efficient, fairer, more equitable. These are all really important uses of technology. The government is a little bit behind. So what we do, and when we look at technology, we're looking to see how technology can be used for fraud. And so we're looking at the other side of technology. How can technology make fraud?
Thank God.
Yeah, exactly. How can technology make fraud more efficient? Where are the blind spots created by technology that allow companies to miss where things aren't being done properly that may lead to the creation of a false claim? So that being said, I think it's important to note that we are a bit behind, but we're trying really hard to keep up with the technology and with the advances that you all make. And so we try to learn and stay on the cutting edge and see where technology can be utilized for malfeasance. And that's really what we're focusing on.
And I mean, how do you keep track of that though? Because nowadays with the large language models, right?
Yeah.
It's very hard to tell whether it's a human being or it's AI at work.
Sure. So we rely to a great extent at DOJ, particularly in the false claims world, on insiders, on whistleblowers. The False Claims Act has a provision whereby cases can be filed by whistleblowers, and they get up to a 30% recovery on what the government brings in a settlement or a litigation victory. It's a very powerful tool for us. Last year, I think there were over 1,200 whistleblower cases filed in the federal court systems. They amounted to a recovery last year of, I think, $2.7 billion, and 68% of that $2.7 billion was healthcare related. So as far as keeping up with the technology and for us to better understand what's happening, we really rely on insiders to come to us. And when they file these cases, they're filed under seal, and it allows the Department of Justice to investigate them. And really, there's a lot of learning that goes into that. I said at the outset I didn't have much experience with healthcare before, or any before I came to the department. And most of the lawyers there are the same. We're not experts in healthcare. So when a case comes in, particularly one that is more on the cutting edge of technology, we have to spend a lot of time getting up to speed and understanding. I'll give you an example. I worked a couple years ago on a EHR case that you mentioned in the introduction, and I spent probably 2 years just trying to understand the technology and speaking with programmers and why things were done, how they were done. That case involved incentive payments under the Meaningful Use Program, which was a program to incentivize practitioners to move from paper to electronic.
Yeah, what's wrong with that?
Well, they cheated on the test to get certified. That's because there was such a race to get to the market. They were incentivized to cut corners on the certification test. So what that resulted in is these software programs that couldn't do what they were designed to do. They didn't meet the certification requirements of the program, and that also implicated patient safety. So anyway, my point being that we spend a lot of time just trying to understand and keep up with the technology.
That's great. And, having worked for large organizations and corporations that have, robust training programs and, double, triple checks and balances to make sure that you as an employee are not making a mistake, it's a different kind of infrastructure than many people in our ecosystem who are entrepreneurs from the startup ecosystem, people who are just getting started in their business. What advice do you have? I mean, they may not even know, especially people who are just sort of, new entrepreneurs who are new PhDs or postdocs who want to do good in the world, but may not understand all of the nuances. What advice do you have for them about all of these things they need to be watching out for?
So I think, first, they should try their best to understand the legal and regulatory enforcement scheme. And that's one of the things that we're doing here today. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm here, is because I want entrepreneurial community, tech community to understand what our resources are, that they can understand how the False Claims Act works. The second thing I think they can do, and people that work a lot in compliance understand this, but if they analyze their risk and then draft or create a compliance program that addresses that risk, that'll go a long way to helping them if a regulator ever does come knocking at the door. And when I say that, I want to emphasize, I don't mean just a paper program that you find on Google and you change a couple titles and you make that your compliance program. But it has to be a real compliance program that is crafted to directly address the risk that your company or your endeavor faces. It's not one size fits all. And if, let's say, for example, let's say you have a startup that has 5 people, the DOJ is not going to have the same expectations for your compliance program as a 1,000-person entity. The other thing I would suggest is, even for small startups, spend a little bit of money on a lawyer and just have him or her kind of educate you on what might be expected of a compliance program and what pitfalls you might fall into at the outset. I think taking those steps and making that investment at the outset is really money well spent. And then you can take that file and you can bring it to DOJ when you meet with them, because if they do come knocking, heaven forbid, and you can say, look, these are the steps we took in good faith to try to be on the right side of this. And I think that really goes a long way with people at the Department of Justice.
That's good advice and money well spent, right?
Yes.
It may not be the sexiest thing you do when you're working on a breakthrough cure, for cancer, but it is money well spent. It's resources well leveraged to ensure that you're doing the right thing, not only in terms of your intent to cure cancer, but also doing it legally. Over the past 5 years, a lot of things have changed in the world. Pre-pandemic, we lived in a different world, and now we're living in a different world. Has the legal landscape changed? What kind of legal issues are you seeing crop up? What is your office? What are you spending more time on? What are these issues?
So I don't think the legal landscape has changed too much, although I do want to talk about the DOJ's cooperation credit program. That has changed significantly. But I think, and this goes back to something I said earlier about the DOJ trying to keep up with what you all are doing. I think it's more a function of the fact that the fraud schemes that we're seeing, or the false claims risk area, are driven by how healthcare, the provision of healthcare is changing. For instance, just COVID and the advent of telehealth. And before COVID, telehealth for a lot of patients really wasn't accepted. A lot of providers weren't comfortable with it. That's changed completely now because of COVID. So that's changed the landscape very much. Advent of technology and all the issues we're seeing with cybersecurity have also changed the landscape. And the DOJ has a new cybersecurity initiative program where they're seeking to bring false claims cases related to companies that have contracts with federal entities that don't have the proper cybersecurity protections in place. So that has changed significantly recently. And then there's just little things like, we're seeing a lot of cases involving wound care in the last couple of years, particularly in our district. We continue to see compounding pharmacy cases.
So explain compounding pharmacies for a minute.
Sure. So compounding pharmacies are pharmacies that will put together a mixture of different drugs for a particular patient. It's the federal health care program, and then the compounding pharmacies will reap the profit.
So, when you think about today's day and age, all the kinds of things that are going on, I mean, we talked at the beginning about the opioid case, right?
Sure.
I mean, that still remains a big issue, right? How do you keep vigilant on these sorts of things on a day-to-day basis?
Well,
sometimes it's like playing whack-a-mole.
Sure, yep, absolutely. And I think one of the things we do, we have to have very strong enforcement and try to bring back as much money for the public fisc as we can. But the other side of that is we want to talk to the market by the enforcement actions that we do bring. So we mentioned earlier the endo pharmaceutical case, the opioid enforcement case. DOJ will issue a press release, and that'll get some coverage, and hopefully the message will spread throughout the industry that the DOJ is looking at that particular conduct and thinks it's objectionable, and will bring an enforcement action if necessary. So I think that's how we kind of stay vigilant. We keep up with the trends. Again, we rely heavily on whistleblowers. And if we can do all of those things, I think we can continue to send messages to the market and kind of keep up with fraud as it arises.
The truth of the matter is that the words DOJ or the letters DOJ or the words Department of Justice does induce a little bit of a fear factor in people. So what advice do you have for people who want to, who are interacting with the DOJ, do's and don'ts? What's the best way? What are the best ways to engage?
Sure, and I mentioned earlier this cooperation credit, and I think that's kind of the hallmark of what I would say is the best way to interact with the Department of Justice. When we bring an FCA case, if it comes in as a whistleblower complaint, as I said earlier, it's filed under seal. That means it's basically secret. Because it's filed under seal, DOJ doesn't have the litigation pressures of meeting deadlines with the court. Generally, the courts allow us time to properly investigate the case. At a certain point in time, the DOJ is going to become overt and interact with the company that's the target of the investigation. At that point, the company has a decision to make. Are we going to be adversarial with the Department of Justice, or are we going to seek to cooperate with them? And we have very strong incentives to encourage companies to cooperate with the Department of Justice, work with us more as partners rather than adversaries in order to work through an investigation. And 9 times out of 10, these investigations are what we call declined. We go in, we do what we need to do to investigate properly, and we're convinced that there's not a claim there, and we shut down the investigation and we move on. I would encourage people that get that knock on the door to work with their lawyers and work with their internal people to come up with a strategy, I think, that is more attuned to working in partnership with the Department of Justice rather than trying, as you might do in traditional litigation, of winning every argument and not giving them the documents and not making your witnesses available. And when I say that there's incentives, there's very strong incentives up to the point of a declination of a case that might otherwise be brought if there's robust cooperation in the investigation.
That's great. And last question actually. Before we wrap up and maybe we take some questions from the audience, what are two or three pieces of advice that you would offer entrepreneurs, founders, investors? Where could they go for additional information about DOJ?
So as far as additional information, check out the Department of Justice website, search for false claims. There's provisions in the Justice Manual, for instance, that talk about this cooperation credit policy that we have, and just educate yourself that way. As far as just general advice for entrepreneurs, I think, again, analyze your risk and understand, particularly from a private equity standpoint, that the further you are involved in the management, in the decision making of the company, the more your risk goes up.
Yeah.
There's a case that was handled in our district. It's from 2019 called Diabetic Care RX that involved a compounding pharmacy company. That was one of the first cases to bring liability against a private equity firm. And we did so because there were a number of emails that really evidenced that the private equity firm was really mired in the day-to-day decisions and pushing the company to do things that violated the False Claims Act. So I think, and obviously a lot of times you have to assert control and management control over the companies you're working with, but just understand that your risk profile increases when you do that. And there's things you can do to kind of to address that risk along the lines of the compliance program that I talked about earlier.
Well, thank you. Let's see if there's questions from the audience. Yes.
What type of route would you suggest, like a whistleblower take to reach out to? Yeah, I appreciate the presentation. Thank you for your time.
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I was asking, like, what type of route would you suggest, like, a whistleblower take to reach out to the DOJ in circumstances of, like, a situation where there's
there's two things you could do. You could make a complaint directly to HHS. They have a fraud hotline. Or you could talk to a lawyer, a KETAM, False Claims Act lawyer that handles these types of cases. And then they can talk to you about potentially filing a complaint in a district court. But I also want to mention your point. There's other things that companies can do to try to keep the whistleblower function internal and disincentivize people from making complaints to the government. And I think your audience might be interested in that, and the fact that that's something that can be properly done. If you make a whistleblower feel that they're heard internally, they're less likely to go to the government and make a complaint. And it doesn't mean that the complaint will get buried. It simply won't have a government enforcement action. I think the thought would be that the whistleblower will be heard. He or she message will be really consumed and analyzed by the company, and action will be taken. And that would prevent the government enforcement action being necessary at all.
So they usually come internally from corporations?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. I think there's a couple more questions. Okay.
This is kind of a quirky question, but I've spent 30 or 40 years in the healthcare space and have watched companies experience deep frustration when there is a whistleblower action. The DOJ begins to dig in, but then it goes into a limbo, which can be 3, 5, 8 years, which is impactful from the company's ability to raise financing. It's a distraction. It's, a red flag for recruiting employees. How do you guys think about the fact that you're not accountable to a timeline? And, is there anything a company can do to bring something to a conclusion when they're trying to be cooperative and in fact feel they have nothing to hide?
Yeah, so a couple issues there. And first of all, I want to say, I didn't say this earlier, I didn't give my disclaimer that I'm speaking in my personal opinion and not on behalf of the Department of Justice. But I worked in private practice for many years. I had to deal with clients and business interruption. So whether it's civil discovery or a criminal investigation, I understand particularly that the problems that causes a business. And I try to tell the lawyers that I work with in my current position that that business interruption that we are causing needs to be something that they're cognizant of, and they need to move quickly and effectively. So I think that's really something important on an individual DOJ lawyer basis. Is important to get that message across, that people understand that they can't just have access and interrupt businesses, and your financing point is very well taken. I know that it's a really important issue. It needs to be disclosed. The other side of that, though, I think is something that enterprises can do is they can cooperate, and they can say, hey, look, what documents do you want? Who do you want to talk to? If you do that early on, I think then you kind of set the tone for the investigation. And I don't think it would be wrong for you then to come in a couple months later and say, look, we made everyone available. What can we do now? And keep pressing with the prosecutor that you're dealing with. I think that's totally appropriate, because cases that sit around for 6, 7, 8 years, and they do, that's too long, and they should be moved as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I think we have one more question here.
Hi, just wanted to ask you about, do you feel optimistic, given DOJ or the government keeping up with, technology and, just innovation that's happening, and also, like financial crimes and cybersecurity matters? I mean, you look at the Sackler opioid scandal, right? You look at the drugs getting passed. You mentioned just going through without getting fully approved. And I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, these big tech and in healthcare, they all have powerful lobbyists that make the government inefficient. So how do you get around that problem? I mean,
so as I said earlier, I think we are a little bit behind on technology, and I think that's just kind of a function of government resources and bureaucracy. But we do really try to keep up. And I'll give you an example. We have very sophisticated data analysis.
The government has unlimited resources at its disposal.
Well, I don't know if it has unlimited resources at its disposal, but that doesn't mean that DOJ does. For instance, right now we're under budget cuts nationally for the U.S. Attorney's offices. So it's how those resources get allocated, I think, is important. But what I wanted to say is we have very sophisticated data analysis tools that help us to identify providers that we call outliers. So these are basically red flags we're identifying. And it's extremely sophisticated, I think, particularly from a government perspective. And I think AI will make it even more sophisticated. So it's not like we're still working with typewriters and what were those machines that you made copies on?
Oh God,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Mimeograph, but
Yeah.
We're not that bad, but we still are lagging a little bit behind. We're doing our best to keep up.
I think we have one more question.
Sure.
Yeah, over there in the back first, and then.
Oh, this was really a fascinating presentation, and thank you for elucidating so many different points. I just want to add, I attend academic AI and deep learning CNN programs, PhD postdoc levels, and recently we had an Ivy League premier scientist speak, and he serves as expert witness in AI. So I think there's a cornucopia that we can find of expert witnesses. And in academia, their fees probably are much less, I would think. And I don't know, in terms of the government, but I'd be happy to follow up with you about that.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yep. Yes. One more question over here.
Thank you for the presentation again.
Sure.
Yeah, like in the landscape in the future, like who do you think would be like the biggest perpetrators that you guys are projecting to be like, you know?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. I think that, as I said earlier, these schemes are constantly evolving. I think we'll just continue to react, and we're not in the business of predicting where healthcare will go, but we are in the business of reacting to trends that we see. So, you know, as I said earlier, telehealth right now is a vehicle for fraud, I would say, rather than an industry focus. It just makes fraud easier. So we're focusing on that at the moment. Cybersecurity issues are also important. But I think as tech continues to evolve, our reaction will continue to evolve.
So, hi everybody on LinkedIn. Thank you for the question. Here's a question for you, Matt, from
Sure.
LinkedIn. The DOJ recently unveiled a task force on healthcare antitrust issues. Through this task force, how are they going to root out monopolies and collusive practices that increase costs?
So I can't answer that question. I'm not involved with the healthcare antitrust task force. I worked really specifically on healthcare fraud related to the False Claims Act. I wish I could answer it, but I'm not the proper person for that.
No worries, but if there are any more questions here, we have time for one last one. Yes.
Just curious, and there's been a lot in the news recently about scrutiny of for-profit providers in healthcare and the perhaps different motivations that may be associated with that. You know, if you look back over the last 5 years, do you have a sense of what percent of settlements have been with for-profit versus non-profit providers, and on a go-forward basis, does being for-profit put you in a higher risk category?
It's a really interesting question, and I don't have specifics on what the mix is between profit and not-for-profit. I would say that, I mentioned private equity earlier. We're certainly aware of private equity's role in the healthcare space and how it's changed over the years. But I want to make very clear, we're not targeting private equity. I will say, however, though, that when I think there's a presumption when private equity is involved that there may be a stronger profit motive or pressure, and that sometimes that those pressures, not always, but sometimes that those pressures can lead to conduct that might be violative of the False Claims Act. So when we see that there's private equity money in an entity that we're looking at, we're certainly asking questions about the role that private equity played, and also pressure that they may have applied that may have caused the conduct that is alleged to be violative of the False Claims Act. But that being said, private equity plays a very important role. It's led to more efficient delivery of healthcare in this country. And so we're not, I said we're not in the business of doing certain things. We're not in the business of getting private equity, but we certainly are cognizant of the role that it plays.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for the audience. Matt, thank you so much. Really appreciate your, educating us about, this whole field and all the watch-outs that entrepreneurs need to be cognizant about. And thank you for engaging with us in this conversation.
Sure, thanks.
It's been great to have you.
So much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our audience joining virtually, for those of you on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, thank you all for joining. And for more information about our work here or to rewatch the tape, go to www.wewillcure.com. And see you again next week. Bye.
Thank you.